Amen. Guys, I got to introduce some people first before I start it. We got some darker people in the room over here. That's my mom and dad. If you guys could say hey to them, make them feel welcome. I figured if I introduce it as awkwardly as possible, like it'd be great if all of you started to come up to him and say hey to him, and they'll feel comfortable after that. So when I was a kid, living in their house, I used to have crazy dreams. And it's funny because I was reminded about this not too long ago. I went over to a family's house where the daughter is having terrible dreams. And as she's describing it, I'm like, that sounds a lot like what I went through when I was your age. And I was able to tell her this story. I had just had a dream. And this is right around the time where my parents had come to the Lord and they had started attending a church on the Air Force Base where we lived. And I don't know if they had talked about spiritual warfare or what, but I remember going to my mom, telling my mom, I had these terrible dreams. And I did not want to go to sleep at night because they were so terrible. And I mean, it was like demonic stuff. And I remember my mom told me, she said, in, the natural black mom way, baby, she said, the next time you go to sleep, I want you to try saying, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. And I'm like, okay, Mom. But in my mind, I'm like, I don't know what that's going to do. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to remember that because it's a dream. So I go to sleep, and I don't remember if it was that night or if a couple nights had gone by, but I remember going to sleep, and as I'm sleeping, I begin having this dream that is just this terrifying dream. And in this particular dream, I remember this one, it was actually my mom. I never correlated that before. It was actually my mom walking down the hallway of the house that we were living at the time, and she had this deep voice and saying all these foul things to me. And I'm washing the dishes. This is how I know I was dreaming. I'm washing. You see all the heads over there going. There's a history there. But I'm washing the dishes in my dream, and all of a sudden my mom starts walking down the hallway with this deep voice saying these foul things. And I just remember I always got this like intense fear that came over me. And I tried to say, I rebuke you in the name of Jesus, but I couldn't get any words out. So finally I just resorted to saying Jesus in my dream. And literally when I got the words out, I woke up instantly. And I remember sitting up in my bed that night thinking, what? And it was the first time where I realized the authority of Jesus over the principalities of darkness. I didn't know what the Bible said. I know now that it says the demons believe, they know who Jesus is, and they tremble. And they tremble. So bringing Jesus into the situation was a very, all of a sudden, real thing to me in my life. And at the time, I think I was probably a middle school kid when I was having these dreams. But going into it, I mean, just so full of dysfunction. I was a believer, but I wasn't living as a believer. You don't know much, I was a newer believer and still cussing and hanging around with my friends trying to be cool and just all kinds of things in my life that was enabling the enemy to mess with me. And that was a very, very memorable moment, one of those first moments where I began to see who Jesus was and how serious this religion, this church thing was in life. And even though I was faithless at that time, because I didn't believe my mom for that. I didn't believe those words were going to be something that could change the circumstance. So it was a shock to me when I saw how drastically they changed the circumstance. But even as a faithless person, I was able to see the faithfulness of God. And I don't know if you've ever been there before, but if you're walking as a faithless person and the faithfulness of God breaks through in a way to where you now understand how real and how evident his faithfulness is, it's humbling. It really is humbling. And it's one of those things that makes you want to change. It's one of those things that makes you want to be better for him. And I believe God is faithful through our dysfunction. It's our dysfunction that causes our disbelief or our faithlessness sometimes, just as human beings. Because we live in a broken world. Like Isaiah said, I am an unclean man living amongst the people of unclean lips. Okay, that was a very Old Testament way to say, I'm a sinful person who lives around a bunch of other sinners. And I'm not worthy to stand before God and not be judged. So it was a very difficult thing to grasp or pull in, to be able to say, yeah, you know what? Calling on the name of Jesus in my dream is going to change something. But I found out real quick how faithful God is. I found out real quick the authority that Jesus has over the principalities of darkness. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, it says, the saying is trustworthy. For if we have died with him, we will also live with him. Okay, so if we've died with him, talking about Jesus going to the cross, and remember, it talks about the blood of Christ being that which cleanses our conscience. Okay, so if we've died with him, if we've died on the cross, that old man has died with him, then now we are entering into this place where there's a relational ability to walk with God in this life. If we've died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, okay, we don't quit on Jesus, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us. Remember, I've told you this before, and you guys have probably read it in the scriptures about that people who refuse to do the things that God called them to. And he says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you. They denied him, thus he denies them. He denies knowing them. There's no relationship there. He says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Amen. That's 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 13. Write it down if you're taking notes. Our journey through Hebrews has brought us into chapter 11. Last week, we looked at a few verses recalling Noah and Abraham and Sarah and the faith that they had to trust God to do things that were just crazy. Didn't make sense. Okay, remember we talked about the portal to pleasing God comes by faith. And Noah demonstrates his faith by building an ark for 100 years, would kind of make him a public spectacle to a people who had never seen it rain before, when he's building this boat, submarine, whatever it would have been, on dry land. Abraham and Sarah, they are promised a son. And Sarah's 90 years old when this son shows up, and Abraham 100. And Sarah laughs because she's like, I'm seriously at 90? I'm also barren, by the way. I can't have children. Okay, and and I've never noticed it before until going back to read that story. Abraham laughed too. Before God, he fell on his face and laughed. And he said, in my old age, I'm 100 years old. So both of them laughing in disbelief, but was God still faithful? God was still faithful to them. And this week we dive in with verse 17, still looking at Abraham. But this, I think, is the thing that he should have started with. Because when you think about Abraham's faith, this is what you think of in verse 17. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. You guys say, no son, no promise. Of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Okay, so Abraham offers Isaac on Mount Moriah. A couple of things to note here. One, God tells Abraham in this passage, let's see if I actually have that section. Nope, I don't have that section in here. God tells us, he tells Abraham to take his only son and to go to a place where he will tell him in the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. Was Isaac Abraham's only son? Those of you guys who know the story? So why does God call him his only son? That's because what? Exactly. Okay, he's pointing Isaac out to be that son of promise, that son of favor. It's a term of favor. Take your only son. Take the son that I have given to you, the son that came to you by way of your 90-year-old wife Sarah. I want you to take that son, and we believe it's maybe 15, 20 years later. Okay, the son that I gave to you, the son that without him there's no covenant, there's no promise to be fulfilled. I want you to take that son and offer him as a burnt sacrifice. Now, it just had to raise up all kinds of questions. Okay, number one, just the command to offer him as a burnt offering is so similar to what was going on in the land, the things that God condemns, the offering of children as sacrifice. Okay, there were gods, Chemosh, and the Baals or the Baals, and the Ashtoreths, and Molech, and all of these gods that were in the land that the pagans, the Canaanites, were worshiping. And then one of the ways that they would worship these gods is child sacrifice. Okay, we know that's written in the history books. And then here is Yahweh, who claims to be different, telling this guy Abraham to do the same thing. Go and offer your son, the son of promise. Offer him to me. And then it tells us the next morning, Abraham got up, took two of his male servants, his son Isaac, and the things for sacrifice, the stuff he needed for the sacrifice, and he began journeying. All right, so here's Abraham. This is Abraham later in his journey. This is not the Abraham that told the Pharaoh or Abimelech that his wife was his sister, so he didn't lose his life. Okay, it's not the same guy. It's not the guy that doubts God, and as they go into Canaan and a famine hits about whether God's going to take care of him, and then he goes down to Egypt to rely upon that which the Egyptians have to deliver him. Okay, this is a different Abraham. This is an Abraham that has met the realities of God speaking forth life into his life. They have a son named Isaac. The impossible has come to fruition. There's that word again. In his life. And he's seen it with his own eyes. And for him, it would have been one of those faith-moving moments where when God comes to him, I believe what it says in verse 19 can be considered valid. Hebrews 11:19, it says he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which he, figuratively speaking, did receive him back. Okay, you guys know the story. On the way to Mount or the land of Moriah, we're going to make a distinction of that here pretty quick, but they were on their way to the land of Moriah. While they were ascending the hill, he told the other guys to stay back. I'm going to take Isaac. We're going to go up. We're going to make an offering, and then we'll return to you. Okay, and on the way up, Isaac, putting two and two together, is like, Dad, I see you got the stuff for the sacrifice. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's response is, the Lord will provide. I think we're seeing a more mature Abraham in this circumstance, because he's either believing that God is going to raise his son from the dead, or he's going to provide an offering for him when he gets up there. And you guys know the story. Abraham gets up there, puts his son down, and he has the dagger raised up to sacrifice his son. And God says, Abraham, has to say it twice. Abraham. If you can imagine being in that position, doing something you just don't want to do, probably having all kinds of question marks about what's happening, you'd be a little bit distracted. God calls him twice, and he tells him to stay his hand. Do not sacrifice. Don't lay a hand on the boy, he says. And then he looks over, and in the thicket, God provides a sacrifice. And then he takes that sacrifice, and he sacrifices the ram that he saw in the thicket. A small little historical fact, that area, Moriah, the land of Moriah, they believe the place where Abraham was going to offer Isaac is Golgotha. Okay, there's a lot of speculation about whether it's Golgotha or the Temple Mount itself. Right, because the Temple Mount, when Solomon, and you can see it in 2 Chronicles 3, Solomon goes to build the temple, he goes to Mount Moriah to build the temple. Okay, so the area was called the land of Moriah, and there was a lot of hills on there. Which hill Abraham and Isaac were on, we don't know. There's no way to verify that. Okay, but we do know that over time in history, there was a mountain that was called, or one of those hills in the area was called Mount Moriah, and that's where Solomon built the temple. Okay, and there's reason for other people to believe that there's a hill next to that where Jesus would have walked out, down from the Temple Mount, and that whole area is now Jerusalem, by the way. Forgot that little tidbit of information. Where Jesus would have walked to those crosses where he would have been crucified. And they believe, many people believe, that that was the place where Abraham and Isaac had their events take place. Either way, we look at what God says to Abraham after this test in Genesis 22:15. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn." We looked at that earlier in the earlier passages of Hebrew. God swore by himself because there was none greater for him to swear by. Okay, so he swore by himself. Because you have done this, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, you're the son of promise, the one I've given to you, you're the son of favor. Because you've not withheld him, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Have we heard God say this before? Yes. So this is now confirmation that God's going to follow up on the covenant that God had made prior to. Now that he sees Abraham's faith, it's double confirmation. You know what? Because you believe me, I'm definitely going to make this happen. This is the word is bond. It's a messianic promise. The promised son will be the reason all the nations of the earth are blessed. Hear me out. Do you see the parallel? The promised son will be the reason that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But listen, both of those are hinging upon faith. Okay? Without faith, Abraham doesn't go through with it. Without faith, we cannot come to the Lord. Okay? If we reject the promise of God, then it's not extended to us. We just read it. If we deny him, then he also denies us. I never knew you. Okay, because the offer is relationship. That denial isn't to spite you. That denial is truth. I never knew you. I never knew you. Okay, we are all workers of iniquity. But the only reason that iniquity sticks with that people who denied him is because they denied the one thing that can cleanse them from their iniquity, their sins. That's Jesus. So if we deny him, he denies us. If we receive him and the work he's done, then we see that the promised son is the reason that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Okay, the author tells us that Abraham's faith came due to realistic perspective about Yahweh that day. He knew who God was. He had experience with Yahweh. So when this day comes, he can put faith in Yahweh that he was either going to receive him back from the dead or provide another sacrifice, and God provides. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Okay? Take you back to our context in Hebrews. The author, talking to a crowd of discouraged believers with Jewish heritage and history who hold Abraham up here in high esteem as the father of the nation. Okay, he's cunningly using the faith of the father of the Jews in this moment. It's the Abraham story to point to the son of promise. Remember, that's the context. He's trying to point these people to Jesus. So everything that we're talking about right now is centered on this focal point that says remain faithful to Jesus. Don't drift away. Okay, don't allow the pressures that are coming from the Romans and the other Jews to drive you away from Jesus. You be faithful. You be faithful like your father Abraham was faithful. Okay, Abraham we know to be the father of the faith, and it's these reasons that we call him the father of the faith. As if Abraham's great faith wasn't enough, he highlights the faithfulness of God to the forefathers of their people, Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and then Joseph. He goes down the chain. Look at verse 20. It says, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. All right, now, when you read this at face value, it makes you ask the question. It's like, there's an elephant in the room right now. So you're saying Isaac's act of faith was when he blessed Esau and Jacob? What about that moment where he laid down to let his dad kill him? I would say that takes faith. Any people in here willing to lay down and allow your parents to kill him? I love you guys, but it ain't happening. That in itself is an act of faith. But what he's pointing out, and with purpose, okay, he's after something specific here. Abraham's faith came because he believed in the promise that it would be through Isaac that God would bring the covenant promise of his offspring, being as the stars in the sky, the nations of the earth being blessed through him. Without the son, there is no covenant. And Abraham fully believed it. Okay, and this is the verse we see, so did Isaac. As we look at this section, as you guys know the story with Jacob and Esau, then it probably is more confusing to you now, but we're going to talk it through. Okay, God wants them, or the author wants us to understand the faithfulness of God. Okay, this family was dysfunctional. And I mean, it was seriously, like you look at families in the Bible, and I think this is probably one of the most dysfunctional families that we read about, especially in the Old Testament. And that's the family that God is using. That's the family that God has chosen. Everybody say, God is faithful through my dysfunction till it's gone. Okay, now he's working that dysfunction out of us, but he's faithful through our dysfunction. Jacob is named Jacob, okay? One of the translations of that name is heel catcher, because when he and his brother were born, his hand came out and he caught onto his brother's heel. There's another description of Jacob by his name. Does anybody know what it is? Deceiver. Do we see Jacob deceiving in the story of his life that we have in the Bible? Yes, we do. And that's why I love the Bible. It's honest about the people that are held up high and esteemed as heroes. Oh yeah, they were mess ups. I can do that too. Okay, so it gives us hope. In the earlier parts we see of the story with him and Esau, we see Jacob kind of using a bowl of lentil soup. All right, and even before we get there, I just want to focus on that one thing where when they were being born, Rebekah was told by God, you have two nations warring in your womb, and the older is going to serve the younger. Okay, remember that. Very important to the story, and why he's picking Isaac here, or that moment where Isaac blesses Esau and Jacob. Well, the two were born. Jacob's named Deceiver. Esau is Red, or hairy. So his name would have been Harry if we translate it into English. So you have Harry and Deceiver. And Deceiver decides when they're older and his brother had gone out and was out hunting out in the field because he was like the man's man, hairy dude, probably smelt like the woods. And his brother Jacob was favored by his mother. Okay, Esau was favored by Isaac. Isaac's like, yeah, it's my son. It's my eldest. Yeah, he was bragging about Esau when they had the get-togethers with all the other guys. You know what he pulled down last week? That's my son. Jacob was his mother's favorite. And I don't necessarily believe, I mean, it talks about him. It says Jacob was perfect, not in the sense of him being a perfect person, but he had smooth skin. Probably a pretty good-looking guy. Counting what in my generation we would have called probably a metrosexual. Okay, so just a good-looking guy, high fashion, and was favored by his mom. And the two are completely contrasted. But you see Esau come in one day famished, hadn't eaten anything. He was dedicated to the hunt. And he's begging his brother for some of the soup that he made. And he says, I tell you what, I'll give you some if you give me your birthright. That's a crazy thing to ask. Give me your birthright, and I'll give you some beans. And his brother says, yes. That's just the start of the dysfunction. So for a bowl of beans, Esau says, you can have my birthright. Remember, when they were in her womb, the older will serve the younger. Okay, that moment passes by. They go years down the road. Isaac feels like it's time for him to die and pass on the blessing to his sons. Okay, the older shall serve the younger. So who's the one that's supposed to receive the blessing according to God? The younger. Which goes against tradition, because traditionally the older gets the blessing. And Isaac prefers the older. He likes Esau better, I suppose we could say. This whole concocted idea where Jacob goes in to deceive his father to take his brother's blessing is terrible. But also you see God's will being played out. This is one of those things when you read the Bible and it just kind of leaves you like, wait, what? This doesn't make sense. I don't understand. How has God's will been done through this deception? Because Rebekah overhears the conversation that Isaac has with Esau saying, my son, I want you to go out there and I want you to go and get some of that game that you make in that soup that I love and bring it back to me and I'm going to give you the blessing. And Esau's like, okay, Dad. So he goes out and he's out for a while. Rebekah hears the conversation, goes to Jacob and says, Jacob, I want you to dress up like your brother and go in there and I want you to ask your father for the blessing. And pretend to be Esau. But Mom, if I get caught, I'm not going to get a blessing. I'm going to get cursed. She says, may that curse be upon my head. This is Rebekah speaking confidently, not because she's sure Jacob could pull it off, because she remembers what God said. The younger will serve the older. So now she's calling that truth to come into, here's that word again, fruition. It's going to come about. And she's confident about it. This is faith in Rebekah, or in what Rebekah's doing, faith in God that Rebekah's carrying out. So Jacob dresses up in his brother's clothes so that he would smell like Esau, and she puts goat skin on his hands that's hairy so he feels like Esau, and then he goes in with the soup that he was supposed to make as Esau, and he says, Dad, here I am. I'm ready for the blessing. And his dad says, it smells like Esau, but it sounds like Jacob. Come closer to me. And you got to know he was shaking at this point. And he gets close to his dad, and his dad smells his clothes and goes, my son. And he believes he's Esau and begins to bless him with a blessing of faith that he's talking about. This is just proof that Isaac also believed God when God said that I'm going to give you this blessing that I gave to your father Abraham. He says in verse 28 of chapter, I forget what chapter I'm even in, and it's in Genesis 27, I believe it is. He says, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Like we hear that and we're like, so where's the blessing? It's a Old Testament way to say, may you be prosperous in all your ways. May God's blessing and favor be upon you. Okay, may the dew of heaven, may it feed the ground, agricultural society. May it feed the ground and may it be plentiful when your crops come up. May you never be lacking. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, your livestock. Remember we talked about the fat was that's like the choice portions is what he's referring to. Of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Who does he think he's talking to? He thinks he's talking to Esau. But it's Jacob that he's blessing. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. Okay, in Genesis 26, the chapter before all of this deception takes place, Moses, who we believe wrote Genesis, highlights a moment when God came to Isaac to relay the covenant he made with Abraham to Isaac. Okay, Abraham's died, Isaac's old, believes he's near death and needs to pass on the blessing to his son, and clearly believes God for it. And we see it in these verses where he believes he's giving the blessing to Esau. So in faith, he's giving this blessing, but he's trying to do it his own way. God said it's going to go to the younger, but Isaac is trying to give it to the older. And it tells us in the story when Esau finally came back in, and he hears his voice, he asks, wait a minute, who are you? And Esau's like, it's your son, Esau. I've come back with the game, with the soup, and I'm ready for your blessing. And it says he trembled. That word in the Hebrew, trembled, it's not because of anger. Some people have preached that he was so angry he trembled. No, it's fear. In the Hebrew word, you see it's fear. What was he fearful of? Because he was trying to do what God told him was going to happen his own way. And he realizes that God and his will has already been done. He couldn't thwart it. So, of course, if you have that kind of personal interaction with God and you try to change it, and then all of a sudden you see it come to fruition, you're probably in fear for your life because you know who this God is, and you realize you've made a mistake. Okay, but Esau, realizing he's not going to get the blessing, and it literally says that he is so angry as he dwelt on it, he wanted to kill his brother. Isaac, because of Esau's hemming and hawing, bless me, Dad, bless me, please, bless me. Isaac does bless Esau, but it's much the opposite in the very beginning. Of the dew of the heaven, of the fatness of the land, it shall not be unto you. Okay, but then he gives him a semblance of blessing because he loves him and he wants to bless his son. And all of this takes place. God's will is done because of the conniving plan Rebekah put together, and it brings conviction over Isaac. Strange, isn't it? Sometimes you read the Bible and you're like, God, I don't understand. I don't totally get that. But we do see your will being carried out. And we see you being faithful when we're faithless. Did I not tell you this was a dysfunctional family? But God still works. Everybody say, God is faithful through my dysfunction till it's gone. Isaac tried to blow up God's plan by blessing his older son, but God brings him back down and basically says, who's in charge of the promise? Isaac is humbled. And then he states a very similar thing. The author of Hebrews states a similar thing about Jacob in the latter days of his life in verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Okay, Jacob's family, like his immediate family, was the most dysfunctional of them all. He married sisters, which, gentlemen, don't do that. For a number of reasons. But these were two feuding sisters. Okay, remember Laban, that uncle, deceived Jacob. That's Rebekah's brother. So do you see the dysfunction in these families? So first he has Leah, then he marries Rachel. They don't get along because Leah is having all these children. Rachel can have none. But Rachel's the wife that Jacob loves. She's the one that he was working all that time, 14 years, for his father-in-law Laban to get Rachel. And finally he has her as his wife, and Leah's bearing all the children. Rachel's resentful. Leah's resentful because Rachel's getting all the time. So they got this feud going on in the house, and that apparently was passed on to the children because all of a sudden you see Joseph come into the scene, and God is giving Joseph these dreams, and the brothers are like, let's kill him. I think that is the worst thing a parent can hear their children say about one another. They're taking a note out of Cain's book. Let's get rid of this guy. So they throw him in a pit. The intention is to kill him. Okay, but the older brother has kind of some common sense to it. It's like, maybe we shouldn't do that. That'd be pretty messed up. That'd really mess Dad up. And they're like, okay, let's just throw him in a pit and leave him then. Okay, we'll do that. And then they sold him off. Okay, and he winds up in the house of Potiphar. Okay, so that's the start of the Joseph story. But Jacob's household is completely upside down. And the beauty of it all is these 12 sons that Jacob has that hate their younger brother, carry out this wicked plot against him, find it backfiring because of Joseph's trust and faith in Yahweh. I love the story of Joseph. Okay, in the latter days of Jacob's life, he's reunited because of Joseph's faithfulness. Joseph could have had them wiped out. Like when he came into power, he could have been like, there's this family. And he could have sent an army to just raid them and been done with them. But he doesn't. And what you see in that story, there's such a beautiful story of a family being reunited. And Joseph, he gets the best of them. He plays with them a little bit. But then he can't take it anymore. And it literally says he breaks. And he starts weeping for his brothers. And he tells them, I'm your brother. I'm your brother. The one you sold off in the slavery, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. The will of God being done, working through the dysfunction of our family to save thousands, to let our people see that he's faithful to the things that he's called us to. Jacob, toward the end of his life, blesses Joseph's kids. And some interesting things go on when he blesses them. In Genesis 48, in verse 13, it says, Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand, that's his younger son, in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near. Okay, Manasseh's the older son, Ephraim's the younger son. So Joseph, facing his father, has Ephraim in his right hand to give to his father's left hand. Why? Because Manasseh, the older one, is supposed to be on the right. And you know what Jacob does? He puts his hands on their heads, crossing his hands. He crosses his hands. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands. For Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on. In the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude into the midst of the earth. When Joseph saw what his father was doing, that he laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not this way, my father. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. So Joseph is trying to correct. Jacob's blind, by the way. He can't see very well. So Jacob, Dad, you're mistaken. You're mistaken. But his father refused and said, I know, son. Such a fatherly way. I know, my son. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Speaking of Manasseh. Nevertheless, his younger brothers shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel, remember he had his name changed to Israel. Jacob did when he was wrestling with God. And he changed him, and he shall now be called Israel. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. So he's passing this covenant down to his sons. Moreover, I have given you, rather than to your brothers, on a mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Ammonites. It's a whole other story where they go into Shechem and wreck shop. But he gives that land that they conquered to Joseph and not to the other ones. I feel like when you look at the lives of these people in these different accounts, you can see the outworking of what we've been repeating the whole time. God's faithfulness raises these faithful children in their dysfunction to become faithful. Are you with me? Did I say that in a weird way? Everybody understands? Okay, God's faithfulness raises these children through their dysfunction, to become faithful. And we're seeing this with Abraham, and we're seeing this with Isaac, and we're seeing this with Jacob. And you know, in all this story, in all of this passage that we're looking at in Hebrews, the only one that we don't see dysfunction with is Joseph. Now, was Joseph a perfect person? Absolutely not. He was human. He was human. But the things that we see with Joseph, again, now that we know what he's after and why he's using these moments, Jacob clearly believed the promise, and that's why he's giving it to his children. Okay, but it was late in his life where he got on board. Isaac clearly believed the promise, but it was late in life. Abraham clearly believed the promise, but it was late in life. Every single one of them later in life are made to be faithful and pass it on to their children because of God's faithfulness and no other. And then we get to Joseph, and it's like Joseph was born with faithfulness, given the ability to interpret dreams, having dreams of his parents and his brothers bowing down and serving him, and then going and telling them about, that's where the faith is, going and telling them about it, and the reason that they hated him. And Joseph lives his life, and it's crazy, sold into slavery, winds up in Potiphar's house. In Potiphar's house, he's elevated to be in command of everything because of God's favor and his hard work ethic. And then Potiphar's wife comes on to him, and he does the right thing and runs out, but she grabs his robe, so he's running out in the street in his underwear, and she screams rape. So they catch up with him, and now he's imprisoned for unjustly, something he did. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. They're like, yeah, right. It's what they all say. Throw him in. And now that he's in prison, he has the chance to quit. His brothers are against him. He can't win for losing. Everybody's calling him a rapist, stuck in this nasty dungeon, but he doesn't quit. He continues to trust God. God elevates him even in the prison, where he's second to none other than the warden, the guy who runs the place. And then the chef or the baker and the cupbearer is the guy who tastes all the food, the drink, to make sure that the king or the pharaoh doesn't get killed by poisoning. They wind up in prison because somebody had a plot to murder the pharaoh. And they have dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams. And it's like, baker, you're dead. You're going to die. Cupbearer, you'll be restored. The baker dies. The cupbearer is restored. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh has a dream, and he needs it interpreted. And then all of a sudden, the cupbearer's like, Joseph, hey, I met a guy when I was in prison who can interpret dreams. They bring Joseph. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. And Pharaoh, which, I'm assuming it's by word of Potiphar and his faithfulness in his house, and by word of the cupbearer, that there's some sort of confidence put in Joseph. I don't know where else it could have come from, because then Pharaoh says, hey, you know what? Who else is wiser than you in all the land? And your God obviously is with you. So I want you to be in command of everything, and you make sure that this famine that's coming, people survive. So all of a sudden, Joseph is second in command of all of Egypt, second to none other than the Pharaoh, by the hand of God. And this is what he meant when his brothers came and kind of toyed with him a little bit. But in the end, it's just got to be open and realize, hey, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. God was doing good through our dysfunction. In Joseph, in Genesis chapter 50, says this: Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation, the children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from this place. He believed in the promise. And we know they took the bones of Joseph. We can read it in Joshua. They took the bones of Joseph out of Egypt when they left Egypt with them and buried Joseph in the land of promise, because Joseph believed God. Jacob believed God. Isaac believed God. Abraham believed God. And that's the point that this whole thing is being unfolded to say, that God desires a people of faith, people who believe him no matter what. And I ask you guys, just as I have to ask myself, do you believe God, as one gentleman put it, with no matter what faith? Are you willing to believe God no matter what? It's the challenge that is being given to these people who are on the brink of leaving, but he's saying, be faithful to the end. He's using the forefathers to help them understand. He's repeating the mantra that Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2:9, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor the heart of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. He's saying, love God by remaining faithful to Jesus. That's how we love God, is we remain faithful to Jesus. Everybody say, God is faithful through my dysfunction till it's gone. We're going to pray, and I'm going to ask Katrina and Carl to come back up. And actually, why don't you guys go ahead and stand.